little shot of that back brace I was telling you about with the two 2x2s on the 1x6, and then you can kind of see the plywood that I've got to spread out the load. Okay, we've got the boat squared up sternwise. I keep forgetting that I put these clamps and some 1x2 and a 1x3, one on either side, and I clamp it down because these little 1/4-inch panels can really, they're a little bendy until you get the rails on, so I always set a couple clamps and some strong backs on either side of the plywood to keep it straight until I get it. I'll keep them on until I actually put the rails on, even after everything's all been glassed and stuff. I keep the strong backs on. Okay, the thing I'm doing now is I've got the boat squared up, it's leveled. I've added some cords and to the middle of the boat, like I said in the subtitles in that last video, to hold the beam down so it can't move, because this boat is going to be tied down off and on every time I work on it. I'm going to have it tied down now while I do all the epoxying and getting the tapes and the seams in, so that the boat doesn't twist from end to end and it doesn't bulge out any one spot, that it stays symmetrical from side to side. The other, I will undo the clamps and move it around a bit, but I'll put the clamps and the levels back on when we get ready to do the interior, because you don't want to have a boat square like this and the seats are going like that. So that has to be squared up too. And then I keep my center line on and my pencil bobs in to give me a reference to whether or not, when I look down and I say, oh, well, the pencil bob is off from the center line, it's not on. So that's done. And I said we were going to get ready to epoxy it, and that'll be the next thing I do. But right now, what I've been doing is putting some masking tape, and I've been using the good painter's tape to so it'll come up over time. And let me reset up again. Go ahead and put the tape on the screw heads, and then use your fingernail to kind of push it in. Add some more tape to the bow end here. You'll find there's a lot of, you'll add a lot of bolts up here or anywhere you got some heavy curvature. Even on my prams up near the bow seams along the edges and on the curvature of the two center panels on the pram itself, the bolts run in about every 3 to 4 inches. Just give it that extra support and to hold those edges in, because the more curvature you have, the more those edges, like I keep saying, try to jump out of place. So now I've got that done. That's the absolute last thing before we start playing with epoxy. And from here on out, we'll be pretty much using epoxy at some stage or another. Either the mixing up the fillet material, the easy fillet put in to fill up the seams. We'll be using epoxy on all the glass taping. We'll be using epoxy to coat all the panels, interiors, and all the edges and all the seat panels and that coating. So okay, it's time to don our gloves and our old coats and stuff and start working with epoxy. You got to remember to, when you're working with epoxy, to always wear protective clothing and keep the epoxy off of you. If you do get a little bit of epoxy on you, use some vinegar on a cloth and get it off, clean it off, and then get some soap. It's not hypercritical, but if you do a lot of it and you get a lot of it on you a lot, then you can build up a intolerance to it, and you start breaking out and other kinds of problems. So always have your gloves on. So now it's time to break out the silver. So I got my 1.5 ounces of epoxy. Now I call this straight mixed epoxy. There's no fillers in it. So sometimes in my text in the plan section, so I'll talk about straight epoxy. This is what I mean. Part A and Part B mixed together. We want to mix it for about 1.5 minutes, And I always do that. I just have a clock in the wall under this, watch it. I just keep stirring along the time. And I got a new toothbrush out, and let me go ahead and stir this, and I'll reset up and turn on some more video lights and get a better idea of what I'm doing. We're going to start wetting out the edges of all the panels. So, okay, we got our mixed epoxy, and we got our toothbrush, and all we're going to do right now is wet out those edges. And this is another reason why I had said in that earlier video that you want to put some tape over the top of the bolts, because it's real easy to fill up those Phillips and slot heads with epoxy. Get a good coat in there, swirl it around, flatten it out. Try to stay inside the marks that we put in earlier. So any lumps or whatever you got there, if you finish off with long strokes, you won't have any problem with any big ridges or lumps that'll give you problems later on. If you do have any lumps or little ghosts, it'll be the epoxy forming these little hollow tubes around the wire that will kind of stay there after you pull the wire out, and you just knock them down with a rasp or something. But okay, one of the other things I wanted to show you was the reason I use the toothbrush is this thing has got a little bit of a flip on the end, so I'm just going to dab that little bit of end into the cup, and that's all the epoxy I'm going to bring out, because then I can get it right down in there. You start dipping it in, you're going to be carrying way too much product to the job, so just dip the end in, get that little end with some epoxy, and then just push it right in there. And then when you get done with a row or a section, flow around, because you're going to have these little spots where the brush hits the wire, where it tries to scrape it off and you leave too much behind. So just come along behind as you go along and carry some of that excess forward, and then watch for runs, and then smooth it out as you go along. It's all going to be epoxied eventually, so, but you don't want to get these surfaces all streaked with little runs and stuff that'll look, you either have to sand down or scrape off, or when you paint them over, you got these little bubbles that mar the finish on it. So I may, when I get done with this, take a 3-inch section of my cheap foam roller and run up and down just to spread anything out, and just as a double check to my runs and my eyes. Sometimes you think everything is fine, and then you come back and then you got a run that just kind of like it hung there and it hung there and hung there, and then you walked away and then it drips. Okay, one of the other things I said that I'll do sometimes is I'll take a bit of foam roller and go along and roll out the seams. And this cage is actually a 3-inch, but since the little thing that holds it on slides down, I can cut them into like 2 inches or 1 inch. I need to go to some junkyard sale and pick up some of these and chop them down to where they're like 1 inch wide. But just come along afterwards and kind of roll out any of the spots around the wires that might be having any excess epoxy. Just kind of spread it around. It's kind of like get rid of any runs that might be a problem. I'll be doing this throughout this project. When I get done with doing any kind of epoxy, I'll roll it out just to get rid of it. That's it. Tomorrow we'll come back and jump stitch this thing with the GelMagic and these